Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2013 Advanced. In the previous section we split a database, in fact an assets database, into two parts, a front end and a back end. And I'm looking now at the front end of the database, and on the basis of our split, if I look at the list of objects in this database, all of the tables are now marked as linked tables, and the tables of data themselves reside in the back-end database, which is in a shared location on my network. In this section we're going to look at some of the consequences of doing this, some of the issues that arise, and in the next section we're going to look at some of the multi-user issues that we need to take account of. Now, before we actually did this split, I didn't talk about what this database actually is and does in any detail. As you can see, there are four tables and all four of them now reside in the back-end database. But in fact, one of those tables is not really intended to be in a back-end database, and it's the fourth one here, the settings table. Now, let me just go into the settings table. I'm just going to open it to begin with. And you'll see that it just has one record in it with an ID of 1, and let me just widen that column, show getting started, and it's a simple record that contains a single field, and the single field is a yes/no field which determines whether to show the getting started screen or not. So that is really all at the moment that is in that table. Now, there are really two distinct possibilities here. One of them is that the person who perhaps designed the database and is managing the database wants at some stage to be able to switch that off for everybody, in which case that table and its contents would need to sit in the back-end database, and with one checking or unchecking of one box, the administrator of the database could either make everybody see the getting started screen or stop seeing the getting started screen. But the much more likely option is that each individual user wants to be able to make that choice. Do I want to show the getting started screen or not? Now, working on the principle that what's actually intended is the second option, that is that each user can use this table, and it's currently its one setting, in order to do a local configuration, then each person, each user is going to need their own copy of that table, which means that we don't want it in the back-end database. So we need to get to a point where the settings table is no longer shared, it's not a linked table anymore, and we also need to make sure that each user has their own copy of it. Now, in Access 2013 that's pretty straightforward. First of all, let's close the settings table. We're not going to save the change. The only change I made was the width of the column there. If you go to the settings table here in the Object Explorer and right click, one of the options right near the bottom there is Convert to Local Table. So if you click on Convert to Local Table, that's exactly what happens. Settings is now a local table, and we no longer are accessing a copy in the back-end database. In this case, we've seen how to use a local table so that a user can have local settings stored in it. But there are actually many other situations where a local table may be more appropriate when you've generally got a shared database back-end. So that can include certainly things like local settings, but also users may be able to set up their own local data, their own local contacts, which are not to be shared with other people, for example. So it's well worth remembering that just because you've got a shared back-end database, when you basically split your main database, you are not precluded from having local tables as well, so that people can have local data. Having said that, don't forget that it's very important to back up your data. One of the great advantages of splitting a database into a front end and a back end is that you can have different backup regimes for the two. The chances are, if you've got good control over the front end, you won't actually need to back it up very often. But the back end database you'll need to back up with a strict regime and with a regularity that reflects both the importance of the data and the rate at which the data changes. If you have got local tables in the front-end databases, as I've just discussed, remember there may be a need to have a good backup regime for that data as well. Again, depending on how much of it there is, how often it changes, how important it is, and so on. Now, so far you probably get the impression that splitting an Access database is a pretty good idea and has a lot of advantages. But in fact, one of the main advantages we haven't even looked at yet, and I want to look at that briefly now. If you separate the shared data from the UI part of an Access database in the way that we just have done, you can save the front-end database as an ACDE file instead of an ACDB file. Now, when you save the database as an ACDE file, all of the code in the database is compiled. This includes the code that is in forms or report modules as well. It also removes all of the editable source code, which is a great security and confidentiality feature, and it compacts the database. And generally speaking, an ACDE file is quite a bit smaller than the equivalent ACDB file. Another very good consequence of this is that generally speaking the ACDE version of the database will use less memory, and performance is generally better as well because it's not necessary for Access to do any compiling. The code that sits in the front-end database is already compiled. Now, saving your database as an ACDE file also places some restrictions on its use. One of the main restrictions is that users can't modify or create forms, reports or modules in Design View. But in fact that may be very good from your point of view, because in effect it means that you can lock down those user interface components of your database and users can't change them. They can't either deliberately or by accident change a form or a report, and that may be very good news for you. They can, however, create and modify tables and queries. So let's just see how you can change an Access 2013 database in ACDE form. It's a pretty straightforward procedure. I'm going to take the database as it is now. I'm going to just go into Backstage View. One of the options, the Save As option here. If you look down towards the bottom of the list under Advanced, there is Make ACDE. File will be compiled into an executable only file. I'm going to select that option and browse to my Scratch folder. So there it is. Click on Save. So having saved the ACDE file, let's just look at the two files there side by side. The ACDB is just under 3,000 kilobytes, just under 3 megabytes, and the ACDE is just over 2.5 megabytes. So the ACDE is somewhere between about 15 to 20% smaller. Now, of course, the amount by which the ACDE is smaller than the ACDB will very much depend on the individual database, the structure and contents of the database, but it will generally be smaller, and for big and complex databases the difference can be quite significant. Now, of course, if I open up the ACDE, it looks exactly like the ACDB. I've got my Getting Started screen switched on at the moment. I'm actually going to switch that off by clicking on the box down here. That will change the setting in my local database for settings. I'm going to close the form. And as you can see, it looks pretty much the same. But if I say go to the Asset Details form there and right click, you'll see that Design View is grayed out. You cannot go into Design View in the ACDE version of the front-end database, and you can't do things like rename it or delete it, cut, copy, paste it. You can view the properties and you can open the data, and you can actually obviously change, add, delete data as necessary. You can also export it. But you're very limited in terms of your ability to maintain forms, make changes to forms, reports and so on, as I described earlier on. So the ACDE version functions in the same way in terms of enabling you to maintain data, but you're very limited in terms of any changes that you can make to the database design or structure itself. Now, when it comes to distributing your database for other people to use, the ACDE option is a very important option to consider. It may not be the only one. For instance, with the ACDE version of this database, created in the way that I've created it, you can still see the navigation pane. One of the things you may want to do is to stop people from being able to access that navigation pane at all. You can minimize it, you can hide it, but you need a bit more trickery than that to stop people being able to get to it. So if you're looking to distribute an Access application using a backend database, the use of an ACDE file is a very important factor to consider. Now, what I'd like to look at next is something that you're very likely to come across, and that is that you may need to move your backend database. Now, given that you may, at the time that you need to move the database, perhaps to a different network location, perhaps your old server is being pensioned off and you've got a new server coming, or maybe space is running short, maybe you need to make the Access database backend visible to more users, all sorts of reasons why you might need to move it. But if you do move it, then obviously each of the people that's using it with their own copy of the front-end database needs to be able to see the new backend. Now, there's a couple of tools within Access itself that help you. What I'm going to do is demonstrate the basics of doing this by moving this backend to a different folder. Now, I'm only going to move it to an adjacent folder on this drive, but the procedure, no matter how you do the move, is pretty much the same as this anyway. So I'm going to take this TA assets database _BE and I'm going to move it from the asset tracking folder to the asset tracking new folder, and then we'll open a copy of the front-end database and see what happens. And sure enough, what happens when we open the database is we get that message from Microsoft Access, could not find file, and then it says it cannot find our back-end database. So click on OK. In this case, it's stopped within the AutoExec macros, so stop all macros. Let's go to the External Data tab, the Linked Table Manager, and basically what we need to do is to tell Access that the backend database is in a different location. Now, if you've got a very, very long list of tables that are all linked to that same new database, then you could use Select All. Bear in mind that you may have tables linked to a number of different sources. Some of these could be to one backend database, some to another backend database. Maybe you've got tables from a SQL Server database or something. In this case, all of these three tables are linked to the same database, so let's check all three. There's an option at the bottom, Always Prompt for New Location. As we'll see in a moment, it's going to prompt us for a location for the database. So having checked those, click on OK. Now what I need to do is to browse to my new location and tell Access that that's where the tables now are. So, and there's my backend database in that new location. So select, click on Open. Access says all selected linked tables were successfully refreshed, so it's managed to reconnect to all of those tables. Click on OK, close that dialog, and our database is now ready to use. So I'd like to look now at one more aspect that follows on from splitting the database. When you've got your users set up, each with their own front-end database, they may be driven mad, as many people are, by Microsoft Access security notices, which pop up every time they newly open their front-end database and say a potential security concern has been identified. There are 2 or 3 ways of getting around this, but in many ways the simplest way is that for each user you make the location where their front-end database is stored a trusted location. So I'm going to click on Open for that. Now let me go into File, Options, Trust Center Settings, Trusted Locations. What I now do is click on Add New Location, and then browse to the location of the front-end database. That's the one. Click on OK. Click on OK. That is now added as a trusted location for this installation of Access. Then I get this message from Access: you must close and reopen the current database for the specified option to take effect. So I'm going to click on OK for that. I'm going to close Access altogether. And now when I open my Access database, I go straight in there without that security warning. So now there's an exercise for you to do. I've made a copy of the latest version of the Movies database, and I've made it example 4 in the exercise files. I'd like you to take example 4 and split it into a front end and a back end. If you have access to a network, or you can access from your PC a suitable storage device, even if it's another PC at home or at work, certainly if you've got a network or a storage device, put the back end on there and make sure that you've used the link table manager to make the database work. I would also like you to make the front end an ACDE file. Once you've done that, my answer to that is example 5. There are two files. There is an ACDE front end and there is a back end file as well. If you have access to a network, or perhaps you have home or work network where you can access somebody else's PC, try splitting the front end and the back end from each other. Use the link table manager as appropriate. Make sure that your database functions in its two parts. If you don't have access to a network and you have to do it all on your own PC, maybe put the two bits in different folders at least, but make sure that your Access 2013 database as a split database is working properly. In the next section, we're going to look at multi-user aspects, so please join me for that.